The cowboy came riding into town with nothing but a weary horse, a patched saddle, and a silence that clung to him heavier than dust. His hat brim was torn at one edge, his boots cracked from miles of prairie roads, and the hollows in his cheeks spoke more of hunger than pride. The town itself offered no welcome, just a dry wind that lifted grit into his eyes, a few shuttered windows, and the slow turning of a sign above the livery. He asked no questions, and no one offered answers. It was the kind of place where men came through, left their coin, and vanished again. By evening, he had found her homestead, a timber cabin standing stubborn against a backdrop of barren fields. Fence posts leaned like broken teeth, and cattle grazed thin over winter-bitten grass. He dismounted without word, only nodding when the widow came to the porch. She was larger than he expected, not by girth but by stature, broad-shouldered, her shadow stretching long in the failing light, her hands resting on her hips with the authority of someone who had buried too much softness. A long scar, half hidden beneath her shawl, traced her jaw. She did not smile. "You'll work the fences. The herd's scattered thin. You'll eat what we eat. And you'll speak little, for I've no patience for tales." Her voice was deep, steady, a tone carved smooth by years of command. He tipped his hat, half in respect, half in surrender. "That'll suit me fine." At her side stood the girl, no more than 10 or 11, yet her gaze was old. She looked at him the way wild colts look at strangers, half curious, half ready to bolt. Her braid was thick, her dress patched twice at the sleeves, and she carried a small bundle of firewood in her arms without complaint. When their eyes met, she did not smile either, only studied him as though weighing his worth. The widow's next words came like a stone dropped in water. "I require a husband, and you require a strong daughter." The air tightened between them. He blinked, caught off guard, unsure whether she jested or spoke prophecy. But her expression carried no hint of jest, only the gravity of survival. She was not offering tenderness. She was laying terms, speaking of need, not of love. He gave no answer, only lowered his hat further, as though the words had pressed him down. He understood, though, at least in part. She had endured too long alone. He had wandered too long unwanted. What she said was not a proposal, it was the plain truth of life carved bare. That night, he ate stew at her table, sitting opposite her and the girl while the wind rattled the shutters. The fire threw light against her face, drawing the scar into relief, making her seem less woman than sentinel. He kept his silence, chewing slow, drinking water as though it were a gift. The girl leaned her head against her mother's shoulder but never looked away from him. He sensed her judgment and her fear, but also something unspoken, a child's wish not to be left again. When the bowls were cleared and the fire burned low, she showed him the loft where he would sleep. No words of welcome, no prayer for rest, just the creak of stairs and the smell of old timber. He lay there long into the night, listening to the widow moving below, the scrape of a chair on the floor, the quiet exhale of a woman who bore the world's weight alone. He closed his eyes, yet her words echoed, "I require a husband, and you require a strong daughter." And so he understood the ground upon which he stood, unwanted, yet needed. Not trusted, yet not turned away. A fragile truce, stitched by silence, held him in that house. The fire below dimmed, the wind pressed harder against the walls, and in the hush between their breaths, 3 lives, widow, daughter, and cowboy, waited to see if necessity could hold them together long enough to become something more. The days settled into a rhythm, though not a gentle one. At dawn the widow sent him to the far fences, where posts leaned like tired soldiers and wire sagged under the weight of years. He worked with quiet determination, hammer ringing against iron, the sweat on his brow tasting of rust and dust. From a distance, he often saw her watching, sometimes with the girl at her side, sometimes alone, arms folded across her chest. She said little, but her eyes missed nothing. The land carried memories like scars. In the shed, tools hung on nails, their handles grey with weather. A saw, a hammer, an axe, all marked with the grip of a man no longer there. The cowboy noticed the boots by the door each time he stepped inside. They had been left where their owner last placed them, as though he might return any moment, though the leather had begun to curl and crack with age. Above the hearth hung a rifle, polished clean, yet never touched. She never spoke of it, never reached for it unless danger stirred, but its presence filled the cabin like a watchful ghost. At night, the girl whispered stories while her mother slept, her voice hushed as though fearful of waking something that lingered in the walls. She spoke of winters when food ran thin, when snow reached the windowsills and the wind carried the howl of wolves. She spoke, too, of men who rode out of the dark one night, demanding the land, firing shots into the sky. Her mother had stood in the doorway with that rifle in her hands, the girl clutched behind her, until the riders vanished into the black. The child's voice trembled in memory, yet carried pride. Her mother had not bent. The cowboy listened in silence, his own memories surfacing like dust stirred by hoofbeats. He remembered the land he had lost to creditors, the papers signed with ink that sealed away a lifetime's work. He remembered a brother who had walked away when he was needed most, leaving only bitterness behind. And he remembered graves, friends left in the mud after battles that had no victory, their faces burned into him each night when he closed his eyes. He did not tell the girl these things. But in her stories, he recognized the same sharp taste of survival, the same loneliness, the same need to keep standing when all else had fallen. One afternoon, as the sun bled low across the horizon, riders appeared at the far edge of the property. They did not cross the fence but lingered, horses restless, faces unreadable in the distance. The widow came out from the barn with her shawl drawn tight, eyes narrowing at the sight. She did not call for the cowboy. Instead, she walked inside, came back with her husband's rifle, and stood planted before her house, tall and unyielding. The cowboy, without a weapon, picked up the shovel he had leaned against the shed. He walked out and stood beside her, not speaking, not posturing, only present. The girl peered from the doorway, her hand gripping the frame until her knuckles turned white. The riders did nothing, just watched for a long, stretched silence. Then, without word or sign, they turned their horses and disappeared into the setting sun, leaving only dust swirling in their wake. The widow lowered the rifle, but her shoulders did not relax. The cowboy leaned on his shovel, feeling the weight of the unspoken. He knew enough to understand, danger had passed for now, but the land was watched. Whatever had haunted her in the past had not yet released its claim. That night, the cabin was quieter than usual. She said nothing over supper. The girl barely ate, her gaze flickering between the rifle on the wall and the cowboy's weathered hands. The fire cracked, shadows shifting across faces that carried their own scars. When he finally lay down in the loft, he could still hear the echo of hoofbeats out on the prairie, fading into memory but not gone. The house seemed heavier, filled with ghosts that refused to rest. And as he drifted towards sleep, he realized he was not the only one haunted. She lived with her ghosts daily, and perhaps it was the only way she knew how to keep standing. The truth was there between them, though neither spoke it aloud. Both had been abandoned by the world in different ways, both bore the weight of solitude. Whether that weight would draw them together or break them further apart was yet unknown. The storm came down from the north without warning, a wall of white that devoured horizon and sky alike. One moment the prairie lay in long windswept stretches of brown and brittle grass, and the next it was swallowed, as if the world itself had been buried under a shroud. Snow rattled against the cabin walls, sifted through cracks in the shutters, and filled the air with a howl that never ceased. Inside, every sound carried weight. The fire snapped sharp in the hearth, its light quivering across beams blackened by years of smoke. The daughter coughed in her sleep, a fragile sound against the rage outside. Boots scraped across the floorboards as the cowboy went in and out, carrying wood until his shoulders sagged and his palms split. Each time he opened the door, the wind shoved its fist into the room, scattering sparks and cold alike. The widow worked by the table, her hand steady, her shawl pulled close. She mended his coat with coarse thread, fingers moving without hesitation. She said nothing as she stitched, and he said nothing in thanks when he laid the coat back across his shoulders. But the act itself lingered longer than words could. By the third day, the snow was pressed against the windows high enough to block the light. The world outside had gone silent, the storm scream buried under its own weight. In that hush, the cowboy spoke. His voice was low, carrying no pride, only fragments of a life dismantled. He spoke of land once tilled by his hands, lost to men who measured worth in coin. He spoke of a brother who had turned from him when the debts came due, and of friends he had buried, their graves unmarked on fields now forgotten. The widow did not answer. She kept her eyes on the fire, her needle moving slow through cloth. Yet her stillness was not indifference. It was the stillness of someone who listened, who measured truth not by words but by the weight they carried. She studied him as she might study the horizon before a storm, calculating, wary, yet not without a strange kind of hope. Nights in the storm stretched long. One evening, lightning split the sky outside, flashing white through every crack of the cabin, followed by thunder that shook the rafters. The girl awoke crying, her breath sharp with terror. She stumbled toward her mother, but it was the cowboy who reached her first. He gathered her into his arms and sat by the fire, rocking her slow, humming something low and broken. The tune was a hymn, though most of its words were lost to him, worn away by time and silence. Still, The sound steadied her breathing until her sobs dwindled and her eyes closed against his shoulder. The widow watched from her chair, her scar lit in orange glow, her hands folded tight in her lap. For a long while she said nothing, but her gaze softened as she saw her daughter's head nestled against the chest of a man who was not blood, not kin, not sworn by anything but circumstance. It was not love she felt, not yet, but something stirred that had lain buried under grief. For the first time in many years, she saw a figure beside her that did not cast a shadow alone, but a shield. When the girl was laid back in her bed, the cowboy remained by the fire, staring into its heart. The widow did not move to her room. She sat across from him, shawl wrapped close, silence holding between them like a fragile thread. Outside, the blizzard still screamed against the world, but inside, something softer pressed close, a warmth born not of fire, but of endurance shared. Neither spoke of what had passed, but both felt it. Trust had not been given, yet it had begun to take shape, like embers glowing beneath ash, needing only breath to rise. The thaw came slowly, loosening the earth with rivers of mud and flooding the lowlands where cattle sank to their knees. The air smelled of damp soil and rot, a season of beginnings and unease. With the melting snow came news that travelled faster than the streams, rumors of cattle driven off under moonlight, of cabins burned, of skirmishes between settlers and the Comanche bands that still rode the trails. The widow heard these whispers from neighbors who passed her gate, their faces drawn tight with suspicion. Her late husband had once carried that rifle above the hearth into fights with the same people. Blood had been shed, and her land lay on the edge of it all, straddling the invisible line between law and the freedom of the plains. She listened without reply, her face carved in stone. It was near dusk when the boy came. He collapsed just beyond the fence, horse long gone, his chest dark with blood. His skin was young, his hair braided, his breath shallow and wet. The widow did not hesitate. She hauled him inside with the strength of someone who had dragged heavier burdens and laid him upon a quilt. The cowboy stood over him, uncertain, his hand brushing the handle of his knife before he caught himself. "You'll fetch water," she said flatly, "and tear cloth for bandage." He obeyed, though unease stirred inside him like a rattler in tall grass. They worked together through the night, pressing linen to the wound, coaxing breath into failing lungs. The boy's eyes flickered open once, fear and defiance mixed, then closed again. When morning came, his pulse still beat, faint but steady. Word spread. By noon a neighbor rode past and saw the boy's horse tethered near the barn, blood dried on the saddle. By evening, whispers swirled that the widow had taken in an enemy. And that night, riders circled the homestead slow and deliberate, their shadows stretching across the walls. They left no words, only a dead calf at the gate, throat cut, belly split. Inside, the air thickened. The widow paced before the fire, rifle across her lap, eyes hard. The cowboy sat opposite, sharpening his knife with steady strokes. At last he broke the silence. "You're inviting death into your house. They won't forgive this. Not the men outside, not the ones who'll come after." She turned, her face lit sharp by flame. "You fear too much. I won't turn a wounded boy into the cold to ease their suspicion. Pride has nothing to do with it, it's survival, and decency besides." His jaw tightened. "And what of your daughter? What if their next warning isn't a calf but a torch to this roof? What good will your decency be then?" Their voices cracked like whips in the cramped cabin, the girl shrinking into the corner, her braid undone from nervous fingers. The widow's shoulders heaved, the cowboy's eyes dark with frustration. Then the girl spoke, barely above a whisper, "If we turn him out, we're no better than wolves." The words fell like a stone in a still pond. Neither adult answered. Both looked at her, then away, shame curling at the edges of their anger. The boy on the bed stirred faintly, the sound of his breathing a reminder of the choice already made. The cabin turned into a crucible. Every sound was sharp, the creak of chairs when they shifted, the steady scrape of blade on stone, the hiss of stew boiling over. Shadows danced high on the walls, firelight flickering across scarred faces and hands that had known too much work. Each glance between them was a test, each silence a tightening rope. Yet beneath the friction ran something else. The cowboy recognized her strength, stubborn though it was. She saw in him not cowardice, but the burden of a man who had known loss too often to risk more. Their clash was not only fear and pride, but the hard shape of two lives grinding against each other, seeking a way to endure. Outside, the riders might come again. Inside, the choice was clear: division would destroy them, unity might save them. In the dim light, with knives sharpened and rifles loaded, they waited for the storm of men to break, knowing that only by standing together could they hope to survive. The boy was gone by the third morning. He left before sunrise, slipping into the grey mist that clung to the fields, his wound bound in fresh cloth, his steps uneven but determined. In his place he left tokens, a small feather, a carved bead, and a strip of hide etched with a pattern neither widow nor cowboy could read. They found them by the hearth, offerings of gratitude, silent promises carried away into the hills. The house felt emptier without him, yet heavier too, as though his departure had marked them with something the neighbors would not forgive. By dawn the riders came. Settlers this time, not Comanche, their faces taut with anger, their rifles glinting in the cold light. They rode hard to the widow's gate and struck it with their fists until the boards rattled. When she stepped outside, rifle in hand, they demanded her allegiance, demanded proof she stood with them and not against. Her refusal was simple, unshaken. She would not bow to any man who told her whom she could shelter, nor would she deny mercy to the wounded. The shouting grew. Boots struck her porch, fists pounded the doorframe. One man lifted his rifle higher, eyes gleaming with the heat of fear disguised as courage. The girl stood frozen by the window, her small hand pressed against the pane, eyes wide. The cowboy moved before he thought. He stepped out onto the porch, placing himself between the widow and the crowd. He had no rifle in his hands, only the rough steadiness of his frame, but his voice carried. "You'll not dishonor her, nor the child. Not while I draw breath." The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. Faces shifted, voices faltered. The mob had come expecting a widow alone, not a man willing to stand at her side. A few muttered curses, others spat into the dirt. But slowly they turned their horses, retreating one by one until only hoofbits and dust remained. No blood was spilled, yet the mark had been drawn deeper. When the door closed behind them, the cabin was still, save for the sound of the fire crackling low. The widow leaned her rifle against the wall, her breath steady though her hands trembled faintly. She looked at the cowboy long, the firelight carving lines into her face, softening the hardness that had shielded her for so long. Her words came low, almost breaking, "I require a husband, and you require a strong daughter." It was not command this time, nor prophecy flung like a stone. It was confession, raw as a wound. She spoke not of need alone, but of longing, for strength beside her, for a father's hand near her child, for dignity restored, for something more than survival. He said nothing, but the silence brimmed with understanding. He removed his hat, roughened by years of weather, and placed it gently on the girl's head. She smiled faintly beneath its weight, the first true smile he had seen on her face. Then he bowed his own head, not to her, not to command, but to the vow unspoken in the fire's glow. The widow lowered her rifle fully now, no longer sentinel but woman, her eyes soft for the first time in years. They did not touch, did not kiss, did not speak of love. Yet love lived in the silence, in the endurance they shared, in the fire that had burned them both and still left them standing. The night stretched long, but it was no longer hollow. The fire between them had shifted, no longer danger but devotion, no longer pride but vulnerability. In that silence, something weathered and scarred had come alive again, not with passion's blaze, but with the steady warmth of endurance. They came at midday, the sun burning sharp against the prairie, rifles flashing in hard hands. Dust rose from their horses as they gathered at the widow's gate. The same men who had once circled in warning, now returned with judgment in their eyes. Their words cut like barbed wire. She had harbored the enemy, taken in a wounded Comanche youth, defied the will of her neighbors. To them, it was betrayal, treason against their kind. The demands were clear, cold as the iron barrels pointed her way. Cast out the cowboy, the drifter who stood as shield to her and her child, or forfeit the land her family had broken their backs to tame. They offered no middle ground, only the bitter taste of surrender. The widow stepped forward before the cowboy could move. The rifle she held was steady, but it was not the weapon that gave her strength. It was the weight of years, of storms survived and graves dug with her own hands. Her voice rose over the restless horses, strong as a church bell on the wind. "This land has known my blood, and my sweat. I have plowed it with these hands. I have buried my dead beneath this soil. No man among you has the right to tell me who may stand beneath my roof, or who may share my fire. This house stands by my daughter, and by the man who has defended us when none of you would." Her words struck harder than any rifle shot. The men shifted, some lowering their eyes, others spitting into the dirt to mask their shame. They had come for weakness, but found a woman unbroken, her defiance a sermon carved into the wide silence of the plains. Beside her, the cowboy said nothing. He did not need to. His presence was no longer that of a drifter seeking warmth, but of a partner rooted in her choice. He carried no claim but stood as if he had always belonged there, shoulders squared, boots set firm upon the widow's porch. The standoff stretched, the air heavy with the possibility of violence. Then, one by one, the settlers turned their horses. Muttered curses, the crack of reins, the fading thunder of retreating hooves. Pride bent their spines, but they rode away all the same. By dusk, the land was quiet again. The widow set her rifle down. The cowboy exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. The girl, standing in the doorway, smiled, small, uncertain, but bright as a lantern in the dark. When the chores called, they answered together. The three of them rode out to mend the broken fences, their silhouettes dark against the evening sky. The sun bled red into the horizon, long shadows stretching ahead of them, three shapes instead of one. He was not her husband by law. She was not his bride in dress. But in the hush of that ride, they bore the weight of something older and stronger than vows. A rifle laid across the cowboy's saddle, the widow's braid loose in the wind, the daughter laughing softly between them, all of it wove into a bond that neither paper nor preacher could sanctify, yet one the land itself seemed to recognize. As the prairie swallowed the last of the light, their three shadows merged into one, carried long across the open earth, testifying to a family not chosen by law, but by survival, by loyalty, by the chance to begin again.